In a quiet hospital room, a patient with profound amnesia listens as someone tells a joke. A moment of confusion, a pause, then laughter bursts out, pure and delighted. A few seconds later, the patient turns and asks, "Can you tell me that one again?" The joke is repeated, and once more, laughter erupts, just as real, just as vivid. Yet when asked their own name, where they were born, or what they did yesterday, they draw a blank. There is nothing there. No story of self. No remembered past. This curious moment highlights a deep mystery. Why does the brain latch on to certain narratives, even as it lets go of the basic facts of one's own life? Why does it seem possible to hold the shape of a story even fleetingly while everything else fades? In laboratory settings, psychologists have confirmed this phenomenon. When people are presented with a list of disconnected facts or numbers, retention is dismal. But if those same facts are woven into a story, however simple, recall soars. The brain, it seems, doesn't just like stories, it's built for them. This presents a striking contradiction. We often celebrate the brain for its rational power, its ability to analyze, to calculate, to reason through complexity. Yet it shows a strange and persistent bias. Cold facts are easily forgotten, but emotional arcs, causal connections, characters, and stakes, these we hold on to. Why? Functional MRI scans have begun to reveal the answer. When someone listens to a story, especially a vivid one, the brain doesn't just activate auditory regions. It lights up the visual cortex as if seeing, the motor cortex as if moving, and even emotional centers as if feeling. In other words, the brain simulates the story. It experiences it from the inside. Listening to a story is not passive reception. It's a kind of mental rehearsal, a neurological emulation of life itself. We don't just hear stories, we live them. This points to a deeper truth. Story is not a cultural luxury or idle entertainment. It's the primary way the human mind makes sense of the world. From ancient oral traditions to modern films and novels, from gossip to courtroom testimonies, stories aren't just how we communicate, they're how we understand. They stitch together cause and effect, embed morality, build memory, and create identity. Long before writing, before agriculture, before cities, humans were already telling stories around fires and caves. The impulse predates civilization. And now, neuroscientists are asking an unsettling, urgent question. What is story doing for us, neurologically and evolutionarily? Could it be as fundamental to survival as language or tool use? If the brain is a prediction machine and stories are structured simulations of what might happen next, then perhaps storytelling is not a hobby. It's a survival mechanism. So the opening mystery stands. Why does your brain care so much about what happens next? Why does it crave arcs, tension, resolutions, so much so that it will invent stories when none exist? The laughter of the amnesiac. Patient is more than a quirk. It's a glimpse into something primal. Perhaps without stories, memory falls apart. Perhaps without stories, the self does too. The real question isn't why we tell stories. It's whether we could endure the world without them. Imagine early humans gathered around a fire, the crackle of flames mixing with the hush of the night. They are not merely keeping warm or cooking food, they are telling stories. These narratives, passed from mouth to mouth and generation to generation, carried warnings, shared wisdom, and bound communities together. Long before agriculture, metallurgy, or writing, there were stories. Anthropologists now suggest that storytelling was not just a cultural embellishment, but a crucial evolutionary tool. It enabled cooperation beyond the immediate, allowing early humans to coordinate actions, transmit knowledge, and plan for futures that hadn't yet unfolded. In this sense, storytelling is one of humanity's first technologies, not of stone or fire, but of consciousness itself. At its core, storytelling is a form of cognitive time travel. It allows us to mentally project forward into imagined outcomes and backward into reconstructed pasts. This simulation function is one of the brain's most remarkable capacities, enabling us to navigate complexity, test hypotheticals, and learn from experiences we've never directly encountered. Neuroscientist Ori Hason's groundbreaking research at Princeton University offers striking evidence for the power of story. In experiments using fMRI, Hasson discovered that when one person tells a vivid story and another listens, their brain activity begins to synchronize, a phenomenon he called neural coupling. The listener's brain doesn't merely receive information, it mirrors the storyteller's internal states. In essence, the story creates a shared mental experience across two brains, bridging the gap between separate minds. This neural alignment engages several powerful systems within the brain. Storytelling activates episodic memory, the ability to recall specific personal experiences, which allows listeners to embed narrative details into their own remembered worlds. It also lights up mirror neurons, specialized cells that fire not only when we perform an action, but when we see or imagine another doing the same. This is part of why we cry in movies or feel tension during a suspenseful scene. We're not watching from a distance, we're experiencing from within. Even more compelling, stories engage the default mode network, a constellation of brain regions associated with daydreaming, self-reflection, empathy, and imagination. This imagination engine powers our ability to envision characters, contexts, and emotional arcs, effectively making storytelling the brain's native language for simulating reality. In the therapeutic world, these mechanisms are being harnessed in practical, life-changing ways. Story-based therapies are helping trauma survivors reorganize fragmented or painful memories. When a traumatic event shatters the sense of narrative continuity, the brain struggles to integrate the experience. But by retelling and reshaping the story, sometimes through journaling, talk therapy, or art, patients can reclaim agency, impose coherence, and begin to heal. Narrative doesn't just help us remember. It helps us remember, reassemble ourselves into a whole. But this ancient operating system is now facing a dangerous new terrain. In the digital era, where every platform competes for our attention, the narrative circuitry that once helped us survive is now being exploited. Propaganda, misinformation, clickbait. These are stories designed not to convey truth, but to hijack emotion. Algorithms don't understand facts, they understand patterns of engagement, and nothing engages like a good story. The more sensational, emotionally charged, or tribal the narrative, the more likely it is to spread regardless of its relationship to reality. This is the dark mirror of our evolutionary gift, the same brain that evolved to simulate risk. Through fables can be manipulated into fearing invisible threats or distrusting lived truths. Thus, we find ourselves in a paradox. The very neural system that helped early humans avoid predators, plan migrations, and build social trust is now being used to steal time, polarize communities, and sow doubt. The storyteller's flame, once the light of collective survival, now flickers through screens engineered to keep us scrolling. And so the tension rises. If stories are how we understand the world, who controls the stories we hear? What happens when our attention, once honed by danger and sharpened by myth, becomes just another product? The brain's ancient operating system is still running, but in a world of infinite stories, are we still the ones writing them, or merely consuming them, one algorithmic fable at a time? A striking psychological experiment once presented to groups with the same basic plea: help save children in a distant country from starvation. One group received detailed statistics: how many children were dying, what the aid would cost, and how it could improve outcomes. The other group received a short narrative about a single child, her name, her face, her story. The result: the group that heard the story gave significantly more money, even when shown both the story and the statistics. Empathy levels dropped. The numbers diluted the emotional impact of the narrative. This landmark finding has since been replicated across fields, in healthcare, law, climate science, and public policy. The implication is sobering. The human brain does not default to rational analysis. It defaults to narrative. We trust what feels coherent, not necessarily what is verifiable. This is not a glitch. It's a feature of cognition. Our brains evolved to prioritize stories over facts. This brings us to a deeper concern. Our brains don't just like stories. They actively reshape reality to fit them. Cognitive scientists have demonstrated that when presented with incomplete or conflicting information, the brain instinctively fills in the gaps to form a coherent narrative. This is called narrative bias. It explains why conspiracy theories, charismatic courtroom arguments, or emotionally charged political ads can override mountains of contrary evidence. A well-told story engages the imagination, the emotions, and the social instincts all at once. It slips past the analytical gatekeepers and lodges deeper. We crave coherence more than we crave truth. But this craving comes at a cost. In medicine, it can lead to misdiagnoses when a patient's story seems more compelling than their test results. In politics, it can sway elections through false but emotionally satisfying narratives. In law, a story that feels true to a jury can outweigh actual forensic evidence. This is the ethical dilemma we now face. The very trait that made us the most communicative species on Earth also makes us susceptible to deception, especially when that deception is wrapped in a powerful narrative arc. Even worse, when we attempt to correct false beliefs with facts, it often backfires. Psychologists have identified the backfire effect, where confronting someone with data that contradicts their worldview doesn't lead to reconsideration, it leads to entrenchment. Their belief hardens. But there's a curious loophole. When the same challenging information is presented within a story with characters, conflict, and resolution, people become more receptive. Stories, it turns out, can circumvent defensiveness. They invite rather than demand. They let us lower our shields and imagine rather than argue. And here lies the central conflict of our era. How do we protect ourselves from false stories when our brains are biased toward believing them? When disinformation campaigns weaponize narrative psychology and truth becomes a casualty of the most compelling plotline. We cannot simply train people to favor facts over fiction, because that's not how the human mind works. We must instead learn to tell better, truer stories. Stories that inform without manipulating, that persuade without deceiving. Because the battle for belief is not being fought in the realm of logic. It's unfolding in the theater of narrative. And if we hope to win, we must learn to speak the brain's native language, not just with data, but with storylines strong enough to carry the truth In the 1930s and 40s, Nazi Germany harnessed the power of storytelling with chilling precision. Through state-controlled radio broadcasts and orchestrated propaganda, they wove a grand national narrative of victimhood, pride, and racial destiny. These weren't dry policy briefs or statistical justifications. They were emotionally charged stories crafted to stir identity and allegiance, and they worked. Millions were swept into a collective delusion, one that enabled and even rationalized atrocities on an unimaginable scale. This dark chapter underscores a brutal truth. Stories don't just build empathy, they can also blind. The very neural mechanisms that allow us to walk in another's shoes can be used to recruit us into dangerous ideologies. What matters is not just that a story resonates, but what it's resonating with. That same power now echoes in our digital lives. Social media platforms, driven by algorithms designed to maximize engagement, have inadvertently weaponized storytelling. Posts that spark anger, fear, or moral outrage, emotional narratives consistently outperform nuance or factual detail. These algorithms aren't evil, they're just efficient. But the effect is corrosive. Emotional stories spread farther, faster, and deeper than reasoned arguments, often polarizing communities and distorting shared reality. Psychological research shows that when a story resonates, it bypasses critical reasoning altogether, heading straight for the limbic system, the brain's emotional core. This is not a failure of intelligence. It's the cost of being human. The ethical consequences of this are profound. In courtrooms, advertising campaigns, and political speeches, the most compelling story often wins, regardless of its truth. A charismatic lawyer can sway a jury with narrative flair. A well-produced commercial can make a product seem essential. A politician with a gripping personal anecdote can drown out data or decades of policy failure. Neuroscience backs this up. Once we emotionally buy into a story, our brains begin filtering out contradictory information. It's not just bias, it's neurophysiological loyalty. We stick with stories that fit our emotional map, even when they conflict with reality. And yet, story is also a lifeline. In psychology, narrative identity theory has become a powerful framework for helping people reclaim control over their lives. Therapists guide patients in reshaping the stories they tell themselves, transforming a narrative of victimhood into one of resilience, or reframing trauma into a chapter rather than a whole. These internal stories give structure to memory, self-worth, and hope. But the same mechanism can also trap us. A person who sees themselves as perpetually unlucky or fundamentally broken may unconsciously filter life through that lens, reinforcing the story over and over. Our inner narratives can liberate, or they can confine. So the question sharpens: are we truly choosing our stories, or are they choosing us? Are the arcs we live by the result of conscious reflection, or are they shaped by culture, trauma, and the invisible architectures of media and memory? We like to think we're the authors of our lives, but perhaps we're more often editors, revising scripts we didn't write. And in an age where stories flood every screen, vying for our identity and belief, the stakes couldn't be higher. The brain on story is beautiful. It allows empathy, creativity, transformation. But it is also dangerous, precisely because it is so automatic. And above all, it is unavoidable. To be human is to live inside a story. The only choice left may be which one. There's a radical insight emerging from the crossroads of psychology and neuroscience. One that reshapes not just how we think about stories, but about ourselves. It begins with a simple but disorienting truth. The self is not a fixed entity. It is a story, a narrative that your brain is constantly telling itself about itself and editing in real time. This insight isn't just metaphorical. Psychological studies show that the way people narrate their own lives, whether as redemptive arcs, tragedies, or chaotic sequences, strongly predicts their mental health, resilience, and sense of purpose. Two people can live through the same objective circumstances, yet emerge with vastly different understandings of who they are, simply because the story they told themselves was different. The implications are staggering. Your identity is not what happened to you, it's how you explain what happened to you. This flips the traditional model of selfhood on its head. Memory, we once thought, was a kind of archive, facts stored away in mental filing cabinets. But memory is closer to storytelling. Each time we recall a moment, we reshape it slightly to fit the current version of our narrative. What we remember and how we interpret it shifts with time, context, and belief. And because morality, values, and decisions are built atop these remembered and interpreted experiences, even our sense of right and wrong is entangled in the plot lines we construct. The twist is as profound as it is unsettling. Identity is not an essence, it's a process, a story in motion. Philosopher Daniel Dennett calls this the center of narrative gravity. The idea that the self, much like the center of mass in physics, doesn't physically exist, but still has real effects. It's a useful fiction, a stabilizing force made of language, memory, and imagined futures. The self is a character our brain plays, using bits of biology and biography. But unlike a novel, the story of self is never finished, it's revised. Moment to moment, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently. This brings us to a fragile, shattering realization. If the story changes, the self changes. When trauma erupts, when dementia erodes memory, when misinformation reshapes belief, it's not just facts that are lost or bent, it's the architecture of identity itself. A person suffering from Alzheimer's doesn't just forget names. They lose the thread of their narrative, and with it, their sense of continuity. A radicalized individual doesn't just gain new ideas. They adopt a new role in a new story, often incompatible with the old self. These aren't metaphorical shifts. They are structural edits to the core narrative that defines who someone is. So what happens when the story breaks? What's left when the narration falters, or when it's manipulated from the outside? The mind, untethered from its guiding fiction, begins to drift. That is the great and terrifying beauty of being human. We are both author and protagonist, writing and living. The story at once, our greatest strength, the ability to shape meaning, is also our greatest vulnerability. We are stories. And when those stories fracture, so do we. Modern neuroscience has come to a powerful conclusion. The brain is not just a processor of information, it is a story machine. When we hear a story, our brains don't merely activate language centers. They light up motor regions as if we're performing the actions, sensory regions as if we're experiencing the textures, smells, or sights described, and emotional circuits that respond as if the events were happening to us. A well-told story doesn't just enter our mind, it recruits our whole body. This discovery has revolutionized the way we think about therapy, education, and even technology. In clinical settings, narrative-based treatments are reshaping lives. PTSD patients undergoing narrative exposure therapy are guided to reauthor their trauma stories, reducing fear responses and reprocessing pain through structured storytelling. In addiction recovery programs, the reconstruction of personal narratives, turning tales of loss into arcs of redemption, is key to long-term healing. These aren't metaphors. Brain scans show that changing your story can literally reshape synaptic patterns. Story is now a therapeutic tool, a diagnostic lens, and even a technological blueprint. AI models, including language tools used in mental health and education, are increasingly trained on narrative structures because they mirror how humans naturally understand the world. Even in the classroom, research confirms that teaching through stories improves retention, boosts empathy, and enhances moral reasoning. Students remember lessons better when embedded in narrative contexts, because stories connect the dots between facts and meaning. In this way, story becomes not just a vessel for learning, but the learning itself. Yet as science confirms the centrality of storytelling to cognition, it also reveals a cultural responsibility. Facts alone, however true, often fall flat unless woven into compelling narratives. This is why misinformation spreads so effectively. It exploits our narrative brains with seductive simplicity and emotional hooks. The solution isn't to reject storytelling, it's to tell better stories. Stories that are rooted in truth, grounded in complexity, and built to resonate without manipulating. Just as vaccines train the immune system to recognize threats, critical thinking must train the brain to recognize narrative tactics. Who is telling the story? What emotions are being targeted? And what's left out of the frame? This is not about becoming immune to story. That's impossible. It's about becoming fluent in its mechanics. Understanding that every belief, every opinion, every identity is shaped by a narrative scaffold. And by learning how stories work, how they influence, persuade, and heal, we gain the power to shape our own. In the end, the goal is not to escape the story-driven mind, but to master it. Because whether we like it or not, we are wired for narrative. And it's only by understanding the architecture of story that we can reclaim authorship of our thoughts, our choices, and the future we imagine together. In the end, when the noise quiets and the mind begins to turn inward, we are left with a story. Not a list of events or facts, but a narrative, fluid, interpretive, deeply personal, that gives shape to who we are. Picture a child looking up and asking, "Who am I?" We don't reach for medical records or genetic codes. We tell them a story of where they come from, what they've overcome, what they might become. This instinct is ancient. It's how we pass down values, remember the dead, make sense of chaos. And whether we realize it or not, we're doing it every day, stitching together conversations, dreams, moments of joy and shame, into a continuous script that says, "This is my life, and this is what it means." Science can map the neurons, trace the dopamine model, the circuits, but meaning is the province of story. It's what makes experience coherent, memory usable, and time bearable. Without narrative, we are just flashes of sensation. With it, we become someone. That's the final, quiet revelation. We are not just beings who tell stories. We are stories told by our own minds, rewritten with every breath, remembered with every heartbeat. And in that, there is both power and responsibility, because if your brain is telling the story of your life, what kind of ending are you writing? Is it a story of fear or growth, vengeance or grace, isolation or connection? You are the narrator. You are the editor. And though you cannot always control the plot twists, you can shape the arc. That's the gift and the burden of consciousness. So let this be a gentle reminder. The brain needs oxygen, the heart needs rhythm, but the soul might just need a story. One that is honest, evolving, and deeply your own.